Hey class, and welcome back. So let's start this first video of Unit 9, which we're going to look at the cardiovascular system. Now luckily for us, of course, we've done the lab in this already, so some of this stuff will be reviewed from the lab. The first part of this unit is going to be with the blood, so let's talk about the blood for a little while. Okay, so the function of blood, or blood circulating in our body, has three primary functions. The first of all is going to be transportation. All right, moving gases around is particularly important. Oxygen, and at the same time getting rid of waste in the form of carbon dioxide. But it also moves around nutrients, it moves around waste, it also moves around hormones, like we talked about in the last unit. Blood can also help us in homeostasis, or general regulation. So changing of the pH of the blood, moving around bicarbonate buffer to help manage pH. Fluid balance, so how much water is in our blood, for example, what's the osmotic concentration. These things will have a big deal to play in homeostasis of the blood. And of course heat. Blood can help us move heat around in our body. We tend to say warmer in the core and cooler in the extremities, so as blood moves around and circulates, it helps regulate temperature. Blood, of course, also is our first line, not our first line of defense, but it certainly is an important role in the immune system. Our blood cells, white blood cells, are very, very important in fighting infections and disease. And also for blood loss. We have a closed circulatory system, so blood can't flow or leak around everywhere in the body. And if we come to a point where we have a problem with bleeding, then we have parts of the blood that are in control or tasked to stop that bleeding, so to regulate blood loss. Now when we talk about blood, we're talking about a connective tissue, remember, don't forget that. So the living part is going to be the cells, of course, and that's what we're going to call the formed elements. And you can see the formed elements down here. That's going to be the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets. And then we're going to have the matrix, which is going to be the non-living part of the tissue, which is going to be plasma. So blood is made up of plasma and cells. Now if we look at the plasma first, well, it's pretty clear. We're a water-based organism. 91% of our blood plasma is going to be water, so it's mostly water. But the other 9% is made up of several different things. 8% of that, so the bulk of that, is going to be proteins. Albumin is the most common protein in our blood, but we'll also have antibodies that are part of our immune system. We'll also have complements, which are also part of the immune system, and clotting factors, which help in case we have bleeding. And then we're going to have other things, and that'll make up the other 1%. So electrolytes, nutrients, glucose, lipids, a whole bunch of other things are present in our blood, and that makes up the 1%. So let's talk about blood cells for the next couple of slides, and the blood cells fall into that category of the formed elements. Now most of these cells are going to be formed in the red bone marrow, and they're going to be formed from what we call a stem cell, or a pluripotent stem cell. In this case, we're going to call it a hematopoietic stem cell. And what this word means is it's going to the cells are going to turn into blood cells. A stem cell is a very special cell because it has the ability to turn into anything. Okay, the body kind of decides what that cell is going to be depending on what the body needs, but it has its start as a possibility for anything. So they're pretty important and pretty special cells. So we're going to go from the stem cell to red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Those are the three formed elements that make up the blood. So I don't want you to spend too much time worrying about this slide here, but what I do want you to realize is we start off up here with this multipotent stem cell. So this is the special cell, you know, that can go anywhere. This can be anything. Depending on what the body needs at the time. So it'll branch out, and as it does, it moves through these steps. Don't worry about these steps. And it finally ends up being either the red blood cells, the platelets, or they can turn into these 5 or 6 different white blood cells. So here's our red blood cells, here's our thrombocytes, and then over here are white blood cells. So this is the pathway that they go through from the stem cell right on down to the cells that we normally see in our blood. So let's talk about each one of these cells individually now. Start with the red blood cells, which are by far the most abundant. When we talk about numbers of red blood cells, we're talking about 4.5 to 5 million per microliter of blood. So a microliter is 10 to the negative 6 liters. So, you know, a very, very tiny quantity. But in that tiny quantity, that tiny volume, we're going to have between 4.5 to 5 million cells. Another word for red blood cells, of course, is erythrocytes. Ereth is a root to the word red, so that's where that word comes from. And of course, whenever you see cyte on the end, that's going to be letting you know that it's some type of cell. So these are tiny, tiny cells, around 7 micrometers in diameter, so really, really small for eukaryotic cells. But the reason is they're not very complicated. They don't have a nucleus. They basically contain this protein called hemoglobin, which is responsible for transportation of oxygen. Okay, we constantly replenish these cells, so their red blood cells are constantly being renewed and replaced from the bone marrow. So your red blood cell typically only lives for about 4 months or 120 days. So it doesn't live for a long time. Then it's broken down, reabsorbed as we make more new cells. The production of red blood cells is stimulated by the hormone erythropoietin, and you guys don't really necessarily need to know that, but when the body needs red blood cells, then the erythropoietin will be secreted, and that'll cause the bone marrow to produce more red blood cells. There are a few things that are important when we're making red blood cells. So our body constantly needs to have a good supply of vitamin B12. It's also good to have lots of iron present and folic acid. So these things are 3 components that the body needs to be effective in producing red blood cells. Okay, so the next group we'll look at are the white blood cells, and these are often called leukocytes. And these are very different from the red blood cells. Okay, they have nuclei for one thing, so the nuclei are quite prominent, they're quite big, and they're easy to recognize. And they're present in much smaller numbers. All right, so in 1 microliter, in the red blood cells, we were looking at between 4.5 to 5 million cells. For the same volume, for white blood cells, we'll only see 4 to 10,000 white blood cells. So we're talking 2 orders of magnitude lower. So, you know, a drastic reduction in numbers. White blood cells function in a lot of different ways to help fight help protect the body of fight disease or infection. And that's the main function for white blood cells, is our immune system. They function to clear the body of foreign materials, so anything that gets in the body that shouldn't be in there, the body recognizes that it's not itself, and the white blood cells will go after it immediately. One of the main things that they do is phagocytosis, and if you think back to early units, we talked about phagocytosis as a form of active transport, moving things inside the cell membrane but using energy. And these white blood cells, depending on what they do, depending on their role, can have a lifespan of from hours up to years, depending on what it is specifically they're doing in the immune system. So the function of the leukocytes are, as we mentioned in the last one, to clear the body of any foreign material. So anything that shows up that shouldn't be there will be looked after by the white blood cells. Now they'll also take care of cells that are old or damaged or anything like that. So they take care of foreign material as well as, you know, cellular debris or garbage left behind by cells or sick or poorly or old cells. So they'll look after pathogens, so viruses, bacteria, protists, parasites, anything like that that enter the body. Our white blood cells will attack it. And the first thing they do is, the first step in our immune system, I should say, is the phagocytosis part. And that's going to be by specific white blood cells, and in this case it's going to be monocytes and neutrophiles. So if you're wondering what these words here mean, neutrophiles and monocytes, those are two different kinds of white blood cells. Macrophages are another example of big, mature monocytes, and plasma cells and lymphocytes become active in the production of antibodies. So these kind of steps right here are going to be part of the immune process, and we're going to get more into that in a later unit. Alright, there's 5 types of white blood cells that you guys should know, okay? Don't worry about these definitions of granulocytes and agranulocytes. Basically what they mean is if we look at a cell, we get a nucleus like this. Usually red nucleus and white blood cells are quite big. Granulocytes will have cytoplasm will be kind of packed with what looks like granules. So the cytoplasm will look quite busy. It'll look like it's filled up with little tiny grains of salt or sand even. So it'll look, really busy. And I'll show you a picture of that in a second. The agranulocytes, so A in front of a word usually means no or not, right? So these two, the lymphocytes and the monocytes, they'll have your cell membrane, they'll have, a big nucleus, and the nucleus will usually stain quite a bit darker than the cytoplasm, but there won't be any of the granulocytes in the cytoplasm, okay? It's agranular. But don't need to worry about those definitions. What I do need you to know, though, are the neutrophiles, the eosinophiles, and the basophiles, and the lymphocytes and the monocytes. Okay, so let's have a talk about each one of those cells. The neutrophil is the most abundant of the white blood cells, and I'm sure if you guys can remember back in the lab, if you looked at the blood under the slides, you would have seen neutrophils. They've got a really lobated, or a nucleus that has a lot of different lobes. So if we look at this particular cell here, there's 1, 2, 3 different lobes in that nucleus. They also show prominent granules, and if you look in the cell, in the cytoplasm, you see all these little bumps that are in here. That's what the granulocytes are. So those little bumps, they look like sand or grit. That's where they get the granules. Polymorphonuclear. Poly means many, morpho means shape, and nuclear is talking about the nucleus. So polymorphonuclear means it has many different shapes nucleus. So this particular one here has 3 lobes, and it looks like that, but we can have another neutrophil that'll have 3 lobes and it won't look like that. So the nucleus is a little bit of a shape changer. Right. As a mature neutrophil, you can identify them or recognize them relatively easy by looking for that segmented lobed nucleus. The next white blood cell, is the eosinophil, and this one is going to be the very least abundant. So you'll find this in very, very low numbers. It's characterized by the eosinophilic granules that stain orange. So if we look at the granules in the cytoplasm, you'll see all those little dots. Those are the granules. And eosinophilic, philic of course means love. We talked about that before. And eosin is a stain that stains stuff red. So eosinic granules that stain orange, that's what characterizes these cells. They usually have a bilobed nucleus. So if we look at this nucleus, it's got one lobe there, and it's got the other lobe right there. So it's kind of shaped like a U. That's a bilobed nucleus. And this is the white blood cell that we'll see if you get a parasitic infection. Okay, this is the one that will respond. The immune response will, when it rises, it'll be a lot of eosinophiles. Now the basophil is going to be another one that's very, very poorly seen, or it's not very commonly seen at all. Okay, it's present in less than 1% of a blood count, and it's characterized by really dark staining granules, and you can barely see the nucleus. So if we look at this, we can't tell where the nucleus is because it's covered in granules. So those are the granulocytes, and in the next video we'll talk about the agranulocytes.